Two short announcements before tonight's Shir. Next week, Be'ez Hashem, we will have the Shir as every Sunday night. And we will see next week, we move on a week-to-week basis. But next week, Sunday night, we will have the Shir. And tonight's Shir and the Divrei Chizuk are dedicated Le'ilui Nishma So'isha Cheshuva Dvoira Rivka Basra Naftuli Yosef, who perished in Auschwitz, Al Kedushas Hashem, and today was the Yortzeit. Shitanuach b'sholom al mishkova, and she should be a melitzas yosher for the family. They should only know nachas and simchas. So this past Shabbos Kodesh, we read for the Haftarah Chazoin Yeshayahu ben Amoitz, Asher Chozo al Yerushalayim. And it is one of the harshest prokim of Teichocha that we find b'divrei Hanovi. Hoi goy chote am keved avoin bonim mashchisim. Harsh language. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, and the Novi quotes, bonim gedalti v'roimamti v'heim pash'ubi. Why do we read this parsha before Tisha B'Av? So the Rambam in Perek Hey of Hilchos Taniyos writes words that were the source of discussion and controversy. In Perek Hey Halacha Aleph of Hilchos Taniyos, the Rambam writes, Yesh Sham Yomim Shekol Yisrael Mis'anim Behem Mishim Tzorois She'ir'u Behem. There are days in which our people fast because of tragedy that struck us. La'orer halavavois v'leftoyach b'darkei hatshuva. And the Chassam Sofer, Tshuvas Chassam Sofer, Orach Chaim Siman Reish Ches, argues that the Rambam seems to indicate that Tisha B'Av and the other three fast days associated with Chorb Mabayis are not about Avelis, but rather about Tshuva. Because the Rambam writes, Yesh Shom Yomim Shekol Yisrael Mes'ana Behem Mishum Hatzoros La'orer Halavavos V'leftoach B'darkei Tshuva. So obviously, says the Chassam Sofer, Tisha B'Av is more closely associated with Yom Kippur, because Yom Kippur is the only fast day which is Min Torah, and it is directly associated with Tshuva. That is what Yom Kippur is all about. It's a Yom Tshuva, Slicha v'Kapara. And the Rambam seems to say that Tisha B'Av, in a way, is the same. So why does the Rambam make this statement? Isn't Tisha B'Av associated with Avelis? So the Chassam Sofer makes a startling argument. And he says, how did the Navi know that we are supposed to remember days of sorrow and tragedy? In the Torah, we only are commanded to remember days of glory, our magnificent salvation from Mitzrayim, the wandering in the Midbar, and all the Nisim, the miracles associated with Yetzias Mitzrayim and Kriyas Yamsef and the Midbar. So why would we be required to remember days of sorrow and sadness and tragedy? And therefore, the Rambam maintains, no, it's about tshuva. And to me, as I wrote in my Sefer in Moyadim Chelik Beis, to me it goes without saying that Tisha B'Av and the other three tzomis are first and foremost and primarily about Avelis. So the Chassam Sofer was the greatest of sages. It goes without saying. Well, he probably remembered the Braisa in Tanas Daf Lamed, Kol HaDvorim Asurim Ba'ovel Asurim B'Tisha B'Av, and the Chamishu Inuyim. We find Chamishu Inuyim. Achil, Shti, Sicha, Ne'ilas, a sandal, Rechitza. We find these prohibitions in two different areas, Yom Kippur and a novel, So how do they get to Tisha B'Av? From the direction of Yom Kippur or via Avelis? So it's a brayso quoted in Tanas of Lamed, Kol Advorim Asurim B'Over Asurim B'Tisha B'Av, and Chazal go on to enumerate the Chamishu Inuyim. So of course it's about Avelis. And why is Masav Matan Osir on Tisha B'Av? Not because it's associated with Simcha. It ain't always associated with Simcha. It depends what kind of a deal you did. And usually in every business transaction, one party is going to be happy and ultimately the other party less so. So the reason Masav Matan Osir on Tisha B'Av is Shalo Yasiach Das Minhu Avelis. So obviously my interpretation of the Chassam Sofer needs to be, yes, of course there are Dinei Avelis B'Tisha B'Av, but Kviyas Hayoim is Tshuva. But that is far-fetched in my opinion. So I would say Tisha B'Av and the other three Tzomos, Tzom Ravivit, Tzom Chamishit, Tzom Shvivit, Tzom Asiri, are first and foremost primarily about Avelis. And that is why all we say on Tisha B'Av is Kinnis and laments, and all about the Churban and destruction and tragedy and suffering and sorrow. And these are days of mourning, days of Avelis. So how did the Navi know? There are so many things that the Navi knew. So many things that the Navi was Mechadish that are not in Toras Moshe. That is what Nevuah is all about. So what's the wonder of the Nevi'im are Mechadish? That as a people and as individuals, we need to remember not only the magnificent days of glory of our past, we also are required to remember days of tragedy, days of sorrow, and days of mourning. Yes, that is the Chiddush of the Navi. So why does the Rambam write, La'oirer halavovois v'leftoyach bedarkei achiv? So to me it seems so simple. And I speak about this constantly in the 3 weeks. Everybody remembers, Kol dor shelo nivna beis hamikdash b'yomav kilu chorav b'yomav. But that is not the Lashon of Chazal. The Lashon of Chazal is far harsher. In Yerushalmi Yomed Avdalad Omed Beis, Kol dor shelo nivna beis hamikdash b'yomav, malen olav ki'ilu hu hechrivo. Because when we say Ki'ilu Chorav B'Yomav, it is as if it happened in our days. Many things happened in our days, but we do not necessarily bear responsibility. The Twin Towers were toppled in our days. A tsunami hit Fukushima in Japan in our days. So is that relevant to us? So when we say Ke'ilu Chorav B'Yomav, it happened, it transpired in our days. Chazal say no, it didn't happen. Someone did it. And someone is to bear responsibility. And that someone is you. So Chazal say, Kol dor shelo nivna beis hamikdash b'yomav, malan olav kilu hu hechrivo. And as I explained many times, because by mortals, by human beings, it's easier to guard a house, it shouldn't fall, than to rebuild it after it imploded. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows no hardship. Nothing is hard for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And to him it's the same. And the moment we will deserve a Beis HaMikdash, we will have one. And if we don't have one, it is only because we weren't found fitting to have one. We don't have a Beis HaMikdash because we don't deserve one. And if we don't deserve one, that means if we would have a Beis HaMikdash yesterday, it would be destroyed by today. Because if we don't have a Beis HaMikdash, it means that we don't deserve it. And that is what Chazal mean when they say, Kol dor shelo nivna beis hamikdash b'yomav, malan olav ke'ilu hu hechrivo. In Bava Basra Daf Ches Amud Beis, probably the most baffling Agadata in the entirety of Shas. The stories that transpired between Rabbi Babachona and Saba de Beyatuna. a series of interesting anecdotes and misholim and parables and stories. Saba de Beatuna offered the rabbi 2 eggs, a black egg hatched by a black hen and a white egg hatched by a white hen. And the Gemara doesn't explain what do those 2 eggs indicate and what did they want to convey. So the Gemara says that the development of an egg in the body of the hen is 21 days. Coincides with the 21 days between Shavuos B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av. Coincides with the 21 days between Rosh Hashanah and Shmini Atzeres. And the Maharsha explains, and this is remarkable insight. The 21 days between Rosh Hashanah and Shmini Atzeres are associated with tshuva. And as we well know, Rosh Hashanah is the Yom Adin, then we have Aseres Yemei Tshuva, and Kates Mechila Slicha V'Kapora is Yom Kippur, and then Sukkot is Tshuva Miyahava. The Maharsha says the 21 days between Shavuos B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av are the same. They are also designated for Tshuva and Mesugal for Kapora. Because when we do remember Chorban Beis HaMikdash, and we mourn and we lament, and we are in profound sadness and sorrow, we are also required to do a Cheshbon HaNefesh. Why don't we have a Beis HaMikdash? And we do bear responsibility for the fact that we don't have a Beis HaMikdash. So we are required to tshuva. So in a way, the 21 days between Shavuos B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av and the 21 days between Rosh Hashanah and Shmini Atzeres have something in common. So which is the black and which is the white? Obviously, Shavuos B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av are the black. Because the minig is, and the minig was, that Avelim is loy v'shchoirem u'misatev b'shchoirem. The white egg is a moshel to the 21 days between Rosh Hashanah and Shmini Atzeres, al shem hakosav im yiu chatoechem kishonim kasheleg yalbinu. And the minig is in Yom Kippur, b'yamei hatshuva v'haslicha v'kapora, we wear a kittel, we wear big delavan. And the Kohen Gadol, when he atoned for Klal Yisrael and Kodesh HaKodeshim, Avodas Yom Kippurim, he wore a big delavan. So that is the 21 days of the development of an egg, and that was the remez of Saba de Beatuna. So yes, Tisha B'Av is about Avelis. Shavuos B'Tammuz is about Avelis. But it boils down to tshuva. Because when we do remember Chorban Beis HaMikdash, we are required and we are expected, and it is demanded from us to try to be better and to try to be fitting to have a Beis HaMikdash. So what is it that we've got to do? Malan olav ke'elohu hechrivo. So what is expected of us? So the Navi says, Tzoma Revi'ivit, Tzoma Chamishit, Tzoma Shvi'ivit, Tzoma Aseri, referring to the 4 fast days associated with Chorban Beis HaMikdash, Shavuos B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av, and Tzom Gedaliyahu, and Asora B'Teves. Yihiyu leBeis Yisrael, leSoson uleSimcha, uleMoedim Tovim, v'u Emes v'Shalom Ahevu. And many times I asked, and I wrote in my Svarim, what does the Reisha of the Posuk have to do with the Sefer? So the Reisha has various different interpretations. It's an expression of hope, it's a prayer, it's a promise, it's a prophecy that these tragic days of mourning will ultimately be transformed into days of joy. And we will rejoice and we will sing and we will dance. But then the Navi goes on and says, what does it have to do with the Reish? And I feel in my heart it has to do. Because when the Navi prophesies and he promises, at the end of days, ultimately, these days of mourning will be transformed into days of joy. When will it be? You will ask, you will want to know, when will this happen? The Navi says, I can't tell you when, but I could tell you how, and it is up to you. You are the ones to determine when it will be. V'hu emes v'hasholem ahevu. You need to try to understand what brought about the Churban, and only when you rectify those averos could you expect to be zoche, to partake and to experience zoche v'roye b'simchos, to have a Beis HaMikdash. So what brought about the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash? We all recall, we all remember the Gemara twice in Shas, and Bov Mitzvah Pei Dalet and Adon Pei Aleph. Almo of the Haaretz. Dovazen Nishal HaChachomim leNaviim leMalachi Yeshoras velo pirshuho. Till HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself said, Alazva mestirosi shaloi Baruch Hu b'Torah techila. And the Ran explains they didn't really appreciate Torah. They didn't really understand and appreciate and feel what Torah means in our lives as individuals, as communities, and as a people. Lo yehoisu Torah chashuva be'einayim velo asku ba lishma. So in the past year or so, past year and a half, I related this story many times, and I will say it again and again because it always moves me when I relate the story. My late father of blessed memory, Zecher Tzadik Levrocha, passed away somewhat more than a year and a half ago on Chanukah. He arrived in Auschwitz the first day of Shavuos, Tafshin Dalet, 1944. He was 17 years old, and in that day, he last saw his parents and 5 of his siblings. He and 2 brothers were sent left to life, and the rest of the family was sent right to the gas chambers. 1 week later, the Kloisenberger Rebbe arrived in Birkenau. My great Rebbe, and the Rebbe of me and my brothers, and my father. My father didn't know the Kloisenberger Rebbe, but he heard about him. And he was happy to hear that the Rebbe is the next barracks, 1 building next to where he was staying. And he very much wanted to know, to get to know the Kloisenberger Rebbe. But Birkenau, Auschwitz was nothing like the Hilton or the Sheraton or the Radisson. If you didn't like your room, you couldn't go to reception and ask for a different room. You probably would get a bullet in your head. So my father befriended a young boy in his barracks whose name was Hollander. And the boy told him that his father is in the next building. So my father sneaked out in the middle of the night and he looked for Sender Hollander. And he told him, your son is staying with me in the next building and you probably would want to be together with your son so we could swap places. But if we do so, you need to remember that from this moment on, your name is Moshe Weiss and my name is Sender Hollander, and that is what they did. Sender Hollander survived the war, and my father got together with him after they were liberated. In the morning, my father approaches the Kloisenberger Rebbe, and he tells him how happy I am to have the opportunity to be close to the Rebbe. And the Rebbe was taken aback, and he looked at him, and he says, the mindset that Rebbe is helfen, said the Gunish helfen. Judging by your faces, I think most of you didn't understand what I just said. So the Rebbe looked down at him and he said, if you think it's going to do you any good, it ain't going to do you any good. To which my father responded, of course it's going to do me good. I'll have with whom to talk and learning. And the Rebbe was startled and taken aback. And he says, Bocher, bist in Auschwitz, du willst reden and lernen? You're in Auschwitz and you want to talk and learning. To which my father said, yes, I want to talk and learning, because if we won't talk and learning, how will we prevail? How will we survive? How will we ever make it? The Rebbe hugged my father, and they talked and learning for the next 11 months. And they talked and learning for the next 40 years. And my father was probably the closest person to the Kloisenberg Rebbe. So as a 17-year-old boy, my father felt in the depth of his hearts, we need to talk and learning. If we won't talk and learning, we'll never make it. I think that is what we felt for the past 2,000 years since Churban Abayis, Medaf Reden and learning. We need to talk and learning, because otherwise, how will we prevail? So we've been talking and learning for the past 2,000 years. And that was the only thing we could do together. The only thing we had in common. Jews from different countries, from different cultures, different races. Sephardi and Ashkenazi, Hasidim and Litvaks, and Ashkenazim, and German Jews and Yekes. What did they have in common? They didn't speak a common language. They davened in a common language. But that is not enough to bring people together. What did we have in common? We just talked and learning. And that is what we had in common. What we had in common was the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, and the Rambam and the Ramban, and the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. And that is what kept us going. Loi baruchu b'Torah techila. Loi hoisu b'Torah chashuva b'einayim. That what caused Churban Habayis. There's a huge kasha, discussed not only by the Balei Drush and the Sifrei Musa and Chassidus, but by the great Poskim in Simem Mem Zayin, the Bach and the Taz. So on one hand, the Gemara says, what brought about Churban Bayis Rishon? Lo baruchu b'Torah techila, alos v'misterosi. But in Yom Daftes, the Gemara says, Gimel Avedas Chamuras shebeTorah, the greatest sins, the greatest transgressions. Avodah Zorah, Shvichas Damim, and Gilui Arayis. Idol worship, adultery, and murder. So how does the Gemara say in Adorim and Abava Metzia, Shalei Baruchu b'Torah techila? My feeling is this. Of course, what caused Churban Habayis? The direct cause was Avodah Zorah, Shvichas Damim, and Gilui Arayis. But the big question was, how did that happen? How could there possibly be a Yiddish Roitzeach? How could a Jew shed blood? How could a Jew, Zera Kodesh, Zera Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, be an Oived Avodah Zorah? We saw with our eyes, Mamad Har Sinai. We experienced Kriyas Yamsuf. How could a Jew possibly worship idols? How could a Jew be an Oived Avodah Zorah? That is what no one could understand. And that was the question. The only guarantor to the continuation of Avodas, of generations of Yiddishkeit, is Torah. And when you lack in Torah, you take nothing for granted. So we are once again losing children in our generation. Baruch Hashem, we have plenty, we have abundance. We have yeshivas, we have kollelim, we have the best of schools, and we're still losing children in Israel, in America, in Europe, and all the communities. From the most Hasidic, the ultra-Orthodox, to the modern Orthodox, we're all losing children. And I know there are many eitzes. Many valid eitzes. I don't have anything really revolutionary new to say, but I do feel that having your children partake and witness Simchas HaTorah and Simchas HaMitzvah, and a Jewish home, the home of a Ben Torah, should be the happiest place in the world, the happiest home in the world. And when your children will see how cherished you are and how happy you are with your Torah and your mitzvahs, they will wish to follow in our footsteps. And that is the greatest gift you can bestow upon your children, having them share in your Simchas HaTorah. So what no one understood, how did this happen? How did our kids leave the fold? And how did it happen that amongst our people, we had Oivdei Avodah Zorah, Shoifchei Domim, and Megalei Arayos, till HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, Al Ozvam Es Teros. So the direct cause was Gimel Avedas Chamuras Shebetoirah. But the fact that children went astray, that is Al Ozvam Es Teros. So I feel that the greatest gift we could share with our children and bestow on our children and give our children is just have them experience what Simchas HaTorah is, what Simchas HaMitzvah is, and the joy of just being close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So this is our challenge in our generation, and especially in the 9 days, especially on Tisha B'Av, when we mourn sitting on the floor and we remember Chorban Beis HaMikdash. It is not only about Avelis, it's also about Tshuva. So we need to dedicate more in Ahavas Torah, in Arbotzas Torah, in Simchas HaTorah, and in Chedvas HaTorah. This is our challenge, and this is what we do try to achieve every day. And what about Chorban Bayis Sheni? The Gemara says both in Bavli, in Yom Edav Tes and Yerushalmi, in Yom Edav Hey. And the Lashon in the Yerushalmi is, Hoyu Yegeyam B'Torah V'Medaktikim B'Mitzvahs. They were great in Torah. And they were really diligent in their mitzvahs. Silas Chinam Hoyso Beinayim. And if we lost the first Beis Mikdash for Averis Sheben Odom L'Mokayim, what destroyed the second Beis Mikdash is Bein Odom L'Chaveiroi. Hoyesaynim Zeyazeh. So the only way we would be find fitting to have a Beis Mikdash, if we lost the Beis Mikdash for Sinas Chinam, we will have one for Ahavas Chinam, if at all there is a concept of Ahavas Chinam. So Rebbe Kiva is the one that taught us, V'yahavtu l'reachu kamoichu zeh klal godel b'Torah. And that is a very well-known Ma'ameh Chazal, nowhere to be found in the Bavli. It is in Sefra, in Parshas Kedoshim, in Toras Kohanim, and in Perek Tes Yerushalmi, in Mesechet Nedorim. What is not very well known is Ben Azai has a different opinion. And Ben Azai says, Zeh Sefer told the Sodom Klal Godel Heimenno. So Ben Azai was a disciple of Rebbe Kiva, a Talmud Chover. That is what we find in Bavli and Yerushalmi. And in my vision, I could almost see Rebbe Kiva, the greatest teacher of the generation, the greatest sage, Godel Ador. And he sits in Besmedish and he says, V'yahavtu l'reachu kamoichu zeh klal godel b'Torah. Ben Azai, far younger than Rebbe Kiva, gets up and he says, our great master and Rebbe, I think there's a greater klal. And everybody looks at Ben Azai, what a chutzpah. And Ben Azai says, no, it's not me. Rebbe Kiva, isn't that what you taught us? Because you said in Perek Gimel and Masechta Zavos, Chavav Odom shenivra b'tzelem, Chibi Yesera Naidaslu shenivra b'tzelem Elokim. So Ben Azai says, Zeh Sefer told us Odom b'tzelem Elokim Bora Oisam. Now, if we are medaktik Loshan Chazal, I think Ben Azai definitely agrees with Rebbe Kiva that we have to reachu kamoichu is one of the greatest klalim. It's fundamental. It's a basic. Klal godel b'Torah. But Ben Azai says, I think there is a klal which is even more essential and more important and more fundamental. What is it? So Rebbe Kiva preaches love. Ben Azai preaches respect. And he says that is more fundamental than love. Because love by its very nature cannot be uniform. By human nature, we love some people more than we love others. You can't change that fact. Yes, you need to love them all and make an effort. But it never would be the same. That is human nature. We love some more than we love others. But we need to learn to respect those that we do not love. We need to learn to respect those that we cannot love. So Ben-Azai says, Rebbe Kiva, you're right. Obviously is an important klal. But Ben-Azai says what is even more important is the basic recognition that each and every one of us was created b'tzelem Elokim. And each and every one of us deserves respect. That is even more important. So the question was between the two great sages, what is the most basic ingredient required in a just, humane, Torah-dike society? Rebbe Kiva says, "V'yahavtu l'reachu kamoicho," and Ben-Azai says, Rebbe Kiva, our great Rebbe, you are the one that taught us the importance of Chavavodam shenivru b'tzelem. So Ben-Azai says, Zeh sefer tol nesodam b'tzelem alakim baru oisam. You need to respect even those that you have difficulty loving. And this is a challenge for our generation and for the frum community of our generation. Once again, we have too much machlokes and too much hatred and a tremendous lack of kavod and respect. And when tragedy struck an entire generation of Talmidei Rebbe Kiva, Chazal don't say mepnei shelo ahavu ze et ze. Chazal say shelo nahagu kavod ze b'ze. And that substantiates Ben-Azai's argument. Love is important, but respect even more so. So when we do our cheshbon nefesh, approaching Tisha B'Av, yes, we need to invest more in Ahavas Torah and on Botzas Torah and disseminating Torah and a passion for Torah and a love for Torah. But we also need to dedicate far more energy and effort in Ahavas Reim and in Kvoid Chaveira. So the Navi says, Tzoyim Ravi v'Tzoyim Chamishi v'Tzoyim Shvi v'Tzoyim Asiri Yiu leBeis Yehuda l'Sosen u'Simcha. When? The Navi says, I'll give you the formula, how. And you are the ones to determine when. V'hu emes v'ashalom ahevu. The Yerushalmi says in Rosh Hashanah Yud Ches Amud Aleph, Ein emes elu Torah. The only thing in the world that is pure emes and total emes and only emes is Torah's emes. V'chaya yolam nota b'surchenu. When you will love Torah, v'hu emes ahevu, and you will love Shalom, v'ashalom ahevu. Ahavas chinam and kvoid chaveirim. It is then and only then that we will be zoicha. Tzoyim haravi v'tzoyim hachamishi, tzoyim harashvi v'tzoyim hasiru, yiu leBeis Yehuda l'Sosen u'Simcha. So as I said at the beginning of this year, Tisha B'Av is all about Avelis, first and foremost, and primarily about Avelis. It's also about Tshuva, but fundamentally, it's a day of mourning. And Gedolei HaChasidim have an interesting comment. And usually Gedolei HaChasidim have some interesting comments, sometimes totally unexpected. So the very early Sforim of the Baal Shem Tov's disciples write that these are days of mourning, but they are also days of unprecedented opportunities. And our prayers are answered in these days more than in any other time of the year. And it is easier to be zoiche to kirves Elokim than another time. So the Hasidic Sforim write a mashal. Mashalim are very fond, and Hasidim like mashalim basically. So they say, when the king dwells in his palace, it's very difficult to get an appointment and to see the king. There are various different committees, and you need to give a request and write a letter, and it needs to be processed. And there's a process of clearance. and you need to have security clearance, and you need to explain why do you want to see the king, and there are various different deputies and committees, and till you get there. But when the king is traveling, it's easier to see him and to interact and even have a word with him, because he's not at home. He is traveling. He's out there. He sees people. He wants to experience the people. So when HaKadosh Baruch Hu is in Galus, it's easier to have access. He's more accessible. When we are in Galus, so is he. Shchinta begelus. So in these days of Galus and of tragedy, of Churban, Kadosh Baruch Hu might be more accessible. Might be. So it's a beautiful nimshal, beautiful mashal. Does it have any source? I think it does. The Gemara in Yom Daf Nun Dalet says, "Kishenechnasu goyim leheichal, ra'u kruvim ma'urim zeh b'zeh." The kruvim hugged each other. They were embraced. And the goyim were shocked. Yisrael, shebrachosam bracha, v'kralosam klala, you oiskim. This is not what they expected to see in Kodesh HaKodeshim. Tinag v'tinoikis, and they hug and embrace each other. They were shocked. And they brought it out, and they said, this is what they have in Kodesh HaKodeshim. So once again, early Hasidic sources quote from the great Maggid of Mizrich, the Baal Shem Tov's disciple, and his mamshech. Yes, we do have a halacha, chayav odam lifkoid, b'shah sheyoytzer derech. So when time came to part, and the Kodesh Baruch Hu says farewell to his beloved children, b'shah silu kashchina, that was the time of the greatest ahava between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Knesset Yisrael. So in Bava Basra Daf Tzadik Tes, the Gemara says, by the Kruvim, one pasuk says Pnei Mishalochiv, the other pasuk says Pnei Alabayis. Bizman she'oisim retzoyin shel mokom Pnei Mishalochiv. Bizman she'ein oisim Pnei Alabayis. Was there ever a time in which we could say Ein oisim retzoyin shel mokom more than b'shas hachurban? I mean, Churban Abayis wasn't stam. They deserved the Churban. And even Kishayoisim Retzoyin Shel Mokum, the Kruvim only faced each other. They never embraced. They couldn't embrace because they were at the two ends of the Kapiris. Shas HaChurban, they moved towards each other. And they did embrace and hug. And that shows the highest level of ahava of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to us. And that is b'shah sheyoytzer l'derech. And the same idea is brought 3 times by the Chidah in the name of the Ramami Pano, one of the greatest Mikubalim. And the Chidah in Achoymas Anach and the Novi Yeshayahu, Maras Ayin Yumen Nun Daled in the source of the Sugya, Chuvas Yosef Oimetz, Simen Chof Aleph. The Chidah quotes the Ramami Pano, that is the Soid HaZivug Ben Kudishu Barichu V'Knesses Yisrael, and that is our Kiyum Begolos. Dafka, when we leave the Beis HaMikdash that was destroyed, that is the closest we could get to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, b'derech min hadrochim. So the Kruvim were me'uriv zeh b'zeh only twice, b'shas haregel, and once again b'shas hachurban. Once again drawing attention to the 21 days of joy and tshuva, from Rosh Hashanah to Shmini Atzeres, and the 21 days from Shavuos Betamis to Tisha B'Av. So yes, these are not only days of sorrow and mourning, but also days of great opportunity, and days in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu might be more accessible. Kodesh Baruch Hu always loves us, but it manifests itself in its utmost strength in these days of Chorban. So we need to take advantage of these days, take advantage of Tisha B'Av, which should be not only a day of Avelis, but also a day of Cheshbon and Nefesh, a day of Kabbalas, a day in which we need to take upon ourselves to be better, to rectify those causes that brought about the destruction, the Churban of Bayis Rishon and Bayis Sheni. More Avos Torah, more Simchas HaTorah, and far more Ahavas Reim and Kvod Chaverim. And just coming closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu feels our pain, and we should feel His suffering, because when we suffer, He suffers with us, and when we cry, He cries with us. B'chol tzorosam loy tzar. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a Father. And the Pasuk says, V'yodato im levovecho, ki ka'asher yeyaser ish et beno, Hashem Elokecho miyasleku. Most of us sitting here are fathers. Some of us young fathers. Some of us a bit older, like me. But probably most of us, one time or another, hit our children or punished our children. And sometimes a father hits his son or daughter because he needs to do so, or at least he thinks he needs to do so. But whenever he does, he is pained no less than the child. And it's always torture to punish your child, because you love your child. But you think, you might be right, you might be wrong, but you think it's your duty. V'yodato im levovechu ki ka'asher yeyaser ish et beno Hashem Elokecho miyasrecho. And when HaKadosh Baruch Hu inflicts pain upon us, His beloved children, for Him it is painful, inasmuch as we could understand HaKadosh Baruch Hu's pain. But that is the way that we are to relate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu as a father. Ki ka'asher yeyaser ish et beno Hashem Elokecho miyasrecho. When he hit our child, when we punish a child, we feel the pain and we love him evermore. It is the same with the Kodesh Baruch Hu. And that is why b'shas Chorban, hakruvim hayu ma'urim zeh b'zeh, to prove and to show HaKadosh Baruch Hu's love evermore when we suffer and we are in pain. So these are days of opportunity. And we need to take advantage of them to daven, to try to be better, and to hope and pray. שצום הרביעי וצום החמישי, צום השביעי וצום העשירי יהיו לבית ישראל לששון ולשמחו ולמועדים טובים. יהי רצון מלפניך, שיבונה בית המקדש במהרה בימינו ושן חלקנו בשרוסך ושם נעבודך ביראה, כי ימי עולם וכשולם קדמוני יויס בביאס גואל צדק במהרה בימינו אמן.